The morning Clara Marsh drove the county assessor off her land, she was holding a tin pail of creek water in one hand and a surveying stake in the other. And she looked, by all accounts, like a woman who had made up her mind about something a long time ago and was only now getting around to telling the world. The assessor, a man named Delbert Foss, who wore a celluloid collar even in August, had arrived with a revised valuation notice and a practiced air of official sympathy, the kind that city men put on like a coat when they have come to take something from someone they consider beneath argument. He told her the county had made an error in the original sale, that the parcel was encumbered, that a person alone, and here he let his gaze travel across the hollow and the overgrown ridge and back to her, as if the land itself agreed with him. A person alone could not reasonably be expected to make productive use of 40 acres of bindweed and broken shale. Clara set the pail down in the grass. She picked up the stake with both hands. She drove it into the ground at the property corner, one clean strike with the heel of her boot, and she said very quietly that Mr. Foss was welcome to the road. He took it. 3 years earlier, almost to the month, the whole county had agreed she had lost her mind. Clara Marsh was 22 years old the spring the Holt parcel came up at the tax sale. She was living in the back room of her aunt's millinery shop in Grover's Ford, sewing hat ribbons for 4 cents a dozen, and sleeping on a cot with a broken leg propped on a Bible. Her parents had died of the fever within a week of each other when she was 17, leaving a mortgaged farm that the bank swallowed before the grass grew back over the graves. She had 5 years of scar tissue where other people had hope, and she had $12.40 in a tobacco tin under the cot, and she had a habit of watching things that other people walked past without seeing. That habit was the most valuable thing she owned, though she did not know it yet. The Holt parcel had been delinquent on its taxes for 9 years. Old Silas Holt had let the place go after his wife died, moved to his daughter's house in Carthage, and never looked back. 40 acres on the southwest face of Canaan Ridge, the low, wet end of the county, hemmed in by limestone bluffs on 3 sides, and a creek that flooded every April with the reliable cruelty of a neighbor who means it. The bindweed had taken the old cultivation fields in the first 2 years. By now the hillside was a gray-green mat of it, thick as rope, climbing the fence posts and the remnants of the stone walls and the trunks of the oak scrub at the edge. Respectable farmers took one look and kept driving. Clara did not keep driving. She had borrowed Hennessy's wagon on the pretense of a supply run, and she turned it up the Holt Lane and sat at the top for a long time with her hands in her lap, looking at the hillside the way you look at a letter you suspect contains news that will change things. She saw the bindweed, same as anyone, but she also saw the creek, running clear and cold even in late April, which meant a spring above it somewhere, which meant water that did not depend on rain. She saw the limestone bluffs trapping the southwest sun and throwing it back onto the slope like a reflector behind a lamp. She saw the way the hillside soil darkened along the north-facing edges, rich and deep, where runoff had been depositing itself for generations. She saw the foundation of the old Holt house, and she saw, half buried under the bindweed behind it, the low humped shapes of what had once been a set of stone-lined growing beds, raised and terraced in a way that no ordinary dryland farmer would have built them. She pulled the wagon around and counted her $12.40 4 more times on the way back to town. The tax sale was held on a Thursday on the steps of the county courthouse. Clara arrived before the doors opened. She wore her good coat and stood near the front, which caused some murmuring among the assembled men, 2 of whom she recognized as neighboring farmers who had come out of idle curiosity, and one of whom she recognized as Raymond Pruitt, who ran the largest farm operation in the eastern half of the county and had a way of appearing wherever something was being sold cheap. When the parcel was announced and the minimum bid given, $11.60 for back taxes, she heard laughter. Not at her, not yet, at the land. A man behind her said he wouldn't take it if they paid him. She bid $12.40. There were no other bids. The gavel came down. Raymond Pruitt caught up to her on the courthouse steps with his hat in his hand and the kind of warm smile that cost him nothing. He said he admired her spirit. He said the parcel was a trouble, though, a real trouble, and that she had likely overpaid, and that if she wanted to unburden herself of it, he would take it off her hands for what she'd paid, as a neighborly act. She thanked him for his concern. She walked to where the wagon was hitched and drove back out the Holt Lane and sat on the old foundation stones and looked at her hillside for a long time without speaking to anyone, because there was no one to speak to, and that was all right. The laughter started within the week. It was the kind of laughter that moves through a small town the way a summer cold does. Everyone catches it sooner or later, and no one can quite say where it began. Clara Marsh and her bindweed field. Clara Marsh, who spent her last dollar on 40 acres of ruin. A girl alone out there on the Holt place, what did she expect to do? Talk the weeds out? Her aunt delivered this intelligence in the back room of the millinery shop with a face full of genuine sorry, and Clara listened to all of it, and then she asked her aunt if she might borrow the wagon again on Saturday. There was an old man named Peter Skovak who lived on the adjoining parcel to the north, a Czech immigrant who had come to the county in the 1860s and stayed when every other newcomer moved on, stubborn as the limestone itself. He grew rye and kept bees and had a garden that people drove past slowly to stare at, because in a county where gardens were small and dutiful, Peter Skovak's was extravagant, pole beans rioting up their frames, squash sprawling across the paths, tomatoes so heavy the cages bent under them. He was 70 years old and built like a weathered post, and the county had long since stopped offering him opinions because he had a way of hearing them out in complete silence, and then saying something so plainly true that the opinion holder wished they had kept quiet. Clara knocked on his door on a May Saturday. He opened it and looked at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting someone to knock eventually. She told him she had bought the Holt place. He nodded. She asked if he had ever walked that hillside. He said yes many times in Silas Holt's day and after. She asked what he knew about the terraced beds behind the old foundation. He looked at her for a moment with his pale, reckoning eyes, and then he opened the door wider and said she should come in. He had tea on the stove and a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table, a rough sketch of the whole southwest face of the ridge, annotated in pencil and Czech and a little English, the creek marked with its underground feeders, the terraces numbered, and noting what Silas Holt's father had grown in them before the wife died, and the knowledge died with her. He had made the map, he said, because he was old, and things he knew ought to be written down before they weren't written down any more. What Silas Holt's father had grown in those terraced beds, in that wet limestone-shadowed hollow with the southwest sun reflected back at it from the bluffs, was mushrooms. Not wild mushrooms foraged from the forest floor. Cultivated ones, tended ones, great spreading flats of oyster mushrooms, and a variety of honey fungus that Peter could not name in English, but drew for her in pencil, and that she recognized from a diagram in a periodical she had read at the county library, as a strain prized by European chefs and almost unknown in American markets. Silas's father had seeded the beds with spawn brought over by a German neighbor 40 years earlier, spawn that had been growing in the deep, sheltered dark of that limestone hollow ever since, untended and unpicked for 2 decades, spread and expanded on its own through the mycelium that threaded the soil like an underground city. The bindweed, which had smothered everything else on the hillside, could not reach the beds. They were too deep in the hollow, too sheltered. The shade the bindweed created above them had, in fact, kept the beds damper and cooler than they would have been otherwise. The thing that was strangling the land was feeding the thing beneath it. Peter told her this plainly, without drama, and then he poured more tea and said, in his accented, deliberate English, that his father had a saying, "The ground holds more than it shows." He said it the way a person says something they have known for 50 years and find it still true. Clara walked back to the Holt place in the afternoon and pulled the bindweed back from the edge of the hollow and looked. The beds were there, stone-lined, mossy, intact, and in the beds, threaded through the packed leaf mold and the soft black earth, barely visible in the late light, the pale edges of cap after cap after cap. She did not tell anyone. She walked home, and she counted what she had left, which was nothing in the tobacco tin but a legal deed and 40 acres, and she did not sleep for 2 nights, not out of despair, but out of the particular sleeplessness of a person who has seen something and is trying to see it whole. The first order of business was the bindweed. She could not farm the slope until she could work it, and she could not work it strangled under that gray-green rope. She had no money for labor, so she was the labor. She rose before light every morning through May and June, walked the 2 miles to the Holt place, her place, and she pulled bindweed. This is not a figure of speech. She pulled it by hand, root by root, because cutting it only encourages the thing, and because she had read enough to know that bindweed roots run 6 feet deep, and the only way to win is to exhaust them slowly, year by year, by refusing to let them see sun. She cut the stems at the soil, and she heaped them in piles to dry, and she spread sacking over the cleared sections to keep the light out, and she went home in the dark with hands that had begun to roughen and crack at the knuckles. The town saw her on the road in the early mornings sometimes, and the opinion was consistent. She had made a mistake, and was working very hard to prove it. By June she had the upper sections of the hillside cleared enough to see the old fence lines. She dug them out and reset the posts with timber she dragged from the oak scrub, splitting rails by hand in the evenings when the light held. Peter came over the ridge every few days and watched and occasionally offered a word, not instruction exactly, but the quiet remark of a man who had done a thing before and was watching someone do it, and noting where they were right and where they might save themselves trouble. She listened to every word. She had no pride about listening. The creek was what she had suspected, fed by a limestone spring above the tree line that ran cold and steady regardless of rainfall. In July, when the county baked and the other farms watched their kitchen gardens wilt and the creek road dried to white powder, the spring above the Holt place ran without interruption. She built a simple catch basin from flat stones and ran a wooden gutter down to the hollow, and the mushroom beds, which she had been carefully tending now for 2 months, removing dead matter, replenishing with wood chips from the cleared scrub, dividing and respreading the mycelium that Peter showed her how to handle. The mushroom beds drank and grew. The arithmetic of those months counted in the dark. $0 in hand. 2 miles walked per day, 7 days a week. Hands cracked to the second knuckle by August. 1 borrowed wagon. 1 old man's map. 40 acres of legal deed. And underneath, spreading invisible through 6 inches of leaf mold, the mycelium that Silas Holt's father had planted 40 years ago and forgotten, and that had been quietly, patiently, enormously alive the whole time. She picked her first harvest in mid-August. The oysters came first, pale silver-gray, fanning out in great shelf clusters from the old logs at the bed edges, some of them the breadth of her 2 hands laid flat. She filled a bushel basket. Then she filled another. By the time she had gone through all 4 beds, she had 7 full baskets, and was standing in the hollow, in the cooling, late afternoon light, laughing by herself, which was not something she had done in some time. She did not take them to the market in Grover's Ford. She thought about it and decided against it, because the Grover's Ford market was small and local, and the price for mushrooms there was what it always had been, low, the price of a thing people could gather themselves if they were willing to walk into the woods. What she had was not a thing people could gather themselves. What she had was a volume and a consistency, and, if Peter's map was right, a variety of mushroom that commanded entirely different prices in different places. She asked Peter about those different places, and Peter told her about the hotels in the cities and the restaurants and the men who supplied them, produce merchants who ran wagon routes between the farm counties and the city markets 60 miles east. He knew one such man had sold him rye for 20 years. His name was Aldous Kemper, and he came through the county every third week. Clara wrote Aldous Kemper a letter. She described what she had, carefully and without exaggeration: the variety, the volume, the consistency of the spring water supply, the sheltered microclimate that meant she could harvest through October and potentially later if she built cold frames over the beds. She did not mention that she was 22 years old, or that she was alone, or that the county thought she had lost her mind. Kemper wrote back in 9 days. He said he would come see. He arrived on a Wednesday in September in a good wagon with a canvas cover and a young man driving, and he looked at Clara Marsh at her gate with the polite blankness of a man who has been mildly surprised and is not going to show it. He was a broad, careful man of about 50, with the hands of someone who had moved a great deal of produce and the eyes of someone who priced things for a living. She led him to the hollow without preamble. She showed him the beds. She handed him a cluster of the oysters and waited. He turned it over. He pressed the cap. He smelled it with his eyes closed, which Clara noted without commenting on. He said, after a long moment, that he had been sourcing mushrooms of this variety from a grower in Pennsylvania for 3 years, and that the grower had been unreliable and the supply inconsistent, and the price, as a result, higher than it needed to be. He asked her what she expected per bushel. She told him. The number was fair. She had worked it out from what she knew of the Pennsylvania pricing, but it was not cheap. He was quiet. She held herself very still. He said he would take everything she could deliver, and that he would send his wagon the first Monday of every month through the end of the season. She shook his hand. She thanked him. She did not say anything else until he was back over the ridge and out of sight, and then she sat down on the foundation stones and pressed her cracked hands together in her lap, and felt the shape of the thing she had built sitting solid around her like a room she had made from scratch. The town found out by October, the way towns always find out, through Aldous Kemper's young driver, who mentioned it in passing at the feed store, which was sufficient. The news traveled the way news does in small places, first as rumor, then as disbelief, then as the slightly injured revision of people who had been sure they were right. Clara Marsh and her mushroom beds. Well, who would have thought? Raymond Pruitt would not have thought, and he did not like it. He appeared at her gate in the 3rd week of October with his hat in his hand again, and the warm smile again, and this time the offer was different. He wanted a partnership. He had access to more wagon routes than Kemper, he said, bigger markets, and he could move volume she couldn't dream of on her own. She would be better served, he said. And here came the smooth, familiar condescension, wearing this time the mask of practical advice. She would be better served letting someone with the connections handle the business side of things, leaving her to the growing, which was what she was good at. Clara asked him what share of the arrangement he had in mind. He said 70-30, in his favor, for the connections. She looked at him for a moment with the same measured steadiness she had given the bindweed, and the stone beds, and the cold early mornings, and the cracked knuckles, and 5 years of starting from nothing. She said she had the connections she needed, and she thanked him for coming by. He was not gracious about it. His face did something that the warm smile could not quite cover, and he said that a woman alone had real limits, that those limits were not her fault, that he was offering her a way past them, and that she would find sooner or later that the offer would not stay open. She said she understood. He went. She told Peter about it that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with tea she no longer needed to be offered, because she knew where the cups were. Peter listened and looked at the table, and said, in his patient, deliberate way, that a man who tells you your limits is not interested in your potential. He said it the way he said most true things, as if it were weather, observable and factual, requiring no particular feeling about it. The drought came in the following spring, which is to say, the spring of the second year. It came the way bad things come when people have almost started to relax, slowly at first, with a dry February that no one worried about, and then a March with a quarter of its usual rainfall, and then an April that should have brought the flooding creek and brought instead a thin, anxious trickle, and a sky that stayed blue in the wrong way, a bright, hard, white blue that old farmers recognized and did not like. By June, the drought had names. People gave droughts names in that county, not official ones, but the names that stick in memory. This one was called the Long Blank, which described it exactly. The long blank came down on the farming county like a hand pressed over a mouth. The kitchen gardens went first, then the oat fields. The creek road dried and cracked along the wagon ruts. Farmers who had been mocking Clara Marsh's mushroom scheme in October were watching their wells drop in June and not saying much of anything. The spring above the Holt place ran on. It ran because it was fed from the deep limestone aquifer under the ridge, 100 feet below the zone that a single dry year could reach. Clara had known this, or suspected it, reasoned it out from the coldness of the water and the steadiness of its flow. But she had not known it the way she knew it now, watching the county dry up around her while her hollow stayed dim and damp, and the beds kept throwing clusters of pale gray and honey-gold mushrooms into the summer dark. The arithmetic of the long blank, as it played out that terrible summer, Raymond Pruitt lost a third of his oat acreage and mortgaged against the rest. 2 neighboring farms went to partial failure. The Grover's Ford market was thin and desperate by July, half the stalls empty, and the prices for what remained were punishing. Hunger had begun to move through the county, not the dramatic hunger of a disaster, but the quiet, grinding kind. Families eating smaller, putting up less, carrying a look around the eyes that people who have enough food don't carry. Clara noticed. She counted and recounted what she had, what she could spare, what the moral arithmetic of the situation required of her. It was a different kind of arithmetic from the survival counting she did in her first months. This was the arithmetic of what a person is for, which is a harder calculation, but not, finally, a complicated one. She went to see Peter in July and told him what she was thinking. He listened. He said, "The ground holds more than it shows, and so does a person sometimes." He said it as if he were only making an observation, but his pale eyes were warm about it. She began bringing mushrooms to the families along the creek road. Not as charity. She had understood from watching 5 years of proud and struggling people that charity offered that way turns in the mouth. She brought them as barter, a bushel of mushrooms for an afternoon's help, digging out the bindweed still holding the north section of the slope. She needed the labor anyway. The help she got was real, and the families who worked for her ate well, and the arithmetic balanced in a way that had dignity on both sides. By August, she had 6 families working the north section in rotating half-day shifts, the bindweed coming out by the cartload, the cleared ground turning dark and rich in the heat. She fed them all from the hollow. She gave a basket to old Peter every week without asking whether he needed it, because he was 72 years old and too proud to say, and she was not going to make him. And she sold to Kemper every month. The prices held. The city restaurants, she would learn later, had been paying premium prices for whatever mushrooms they could source reliably during the drought season, when so many other things had simply ceased to arrive. Aldous Kemper's young driver came up the Holt Lane on the first Monday of August, September, and October, and loaded the wagon each time and drove away east, and each time the sum that came back to Clara was larger than the month before, because Kemper was an honest man and passed the premium through. She opened an account at the Grover's Ford Bank in September. The teller, a young man who had been 2 years ahead of her in school and had not spoken to her since, looked at the deposit figure and looked at her and looked at the figure again, with an expression she would think about sometimes in later years, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the clear memory of what being seen accurately for the first time feels like after years of being seen as the wrong thing. It was in October that Raymond Pruitt made his second move. He had a cousin on the county land records board, and through this cousin he had filed a question, not a challenge exactly, not yet, but a formal inquiry, about whether the original tax sale of the Holt parcel had been properly conducted, specifically whether the minimum bid had been correctly calculated against the assessed value, and whether, if a calculation error were found, the deed might be revisited. The inquiry was worded in the careful procedural language of a man who knows the machinery of official things and is not above using it. Clara learned of the inquiry from the county recorder, a woman named Mrs. Elspeth Tanner, who had been recording deeds in Grover's Ford for 30 years, and who told Clara about it in the direct, slightly tired manner of someone who has seen this kind of thing before and does not approve. Mrs. Tanner said Clara should probably get a lawyer. Clara said she could not afford a lawyer, which was not entirely true anymore, but was still her first instinct. Mrs. Tanner said she should come back in 2 days. When Clara came back in 2 days, Mrs. Tanner had the original tax sale records on her desk, annotated in red ink in Mrs. Tanner's own hand, each calculation checked and rechecked, the assessed value of the parcel at the time of delinquency noted, and the minimum bid, $11.60, confirmed as correct to the penny. The assessed value of the Holt parcel had been rock bottom because the land was considered rock bottom. No error. No basis for an inquiry. There was also, in Mrs. Tanner's neat handwriting at the bottom of the last page, a note pointing out that the assessed value of the parcel would now need to be revised upward given the productive improvements made to the property in the intervening 2 years, and that this reassessment would be calculated in the normal way and arrive in the normal time, and that this was the correct and only proper response to what had been filed. Mrs. Tanner said, handing the file across, that a person who paid $12.40 for land worth considerably more than that now had made a fine piece of business, and that the county recorder's office wished her well with it. Clara thanked her. She walked back out into the October street and stood for a moment in the cool, bright morning, and the town moved around her, wagons and foot traffic, and the smell of smoke from the blacksmith down the block, and she felt the peculiar, grounded calm of a person who has been afraid of a thing and met it and found it smaller than the fear. It was 2 days later that Delbert Foss appeared with his revised valuation notice and his celluloid collar and his official sympathy, and Clara drove him off with a survey stake and 1 sentence, which is where this story began and which it is now time to understand fully. The valuation Foss brought was not fraudulent. It was real, the reassessment Mrs. Tanner had predicted, and it was high, very high, reflecting the sudden visibility of what the Holt parcel had become. The tax burden on the new assessment would have been difficult for someone who had not been selling mushrooms to Aldous Kemper for 14 months. It was not difficult for Clara Marsh. She paid it in December without drama, walked into the county clerk's office, laid the payment on the counter, and walked back out. Raymond Pruitt's inquiry went nowhere. The cousin on the Land Records Board, it emerged during the quiet procedural review that Mrs. Tanner had apparently caused to be initiated, had received a side payment from Pruitt for his trouble, a thing that was not only improper but demonstrably so, documented in the cousin's own receipts. This became known around the county in the way those things become known, completely and quickly and without mercy for the person it concerned. Pruitt did not appear in the market square for most of November. When he reappeared, he was quieter. The families along the creek road had noticed, through the summer and fall, that the woman on the Holt place had fed them when they were hungry and put work in their hands when they needed it, and had asked no debt of them beyond the labor they had already given. This is the kind of thing that does not require a speech. It simply becomes part of what a person is, in a community's collective memory, and it stays there. By the winter of that second year, Clara had two permanent hired workers, a brother and sister, Jonas and Matilda Sweat, aged 14 and 16, who lived with their widowed father 3 miles north and who had been among the barter laborers in the summer. She paid them in wages, real ones, not in kind, and she was precise about the rate because she had been paid unfair wages herself and remembered what it felt like. Jonas could read a Hillside's drainage by eye within 2 seasons of working with her. Matilda had an instinct for the beds that Peter said he hadn't seen in 60 years of growing things. It was Matilda who named the flocks, when Clara, thinking of Peter's advice about diversification, about not depending on one thing alone, brought in a small flock of geese to manage the bindweed on the outer sections. The geese were large and pale, and moved with the magnificent, irrelevant dignity of creatures who have no opinion of themselves, but would like you to get out of their way. Matilda named all 11 of them within the first week, naming being something she applied to any living thing she considered under her care, and thereafter they were, individually and collectively, a source of considerable comment among the people who visited the Holt place and found themselves unable to keep a straight face when Matilda called them in from the field by name, one by one, and they came. Clara allowed this. She thought the geese were, in fact, ridiculous. She also thought they were eating the bindweed at a rate that would have taken her 50 hours of hand-pulling to match, and that their manure was enriching the cleared sections in a way that was already visibly affecting the soil color, and that one of them, the largest, a gander named Augustus by Matilda, though Clara privately called him the Colonel, had taken to stationing himself at the lane entrance and warning her of visitors with a racket that no watchdog could have improved upon. She thought a person would have to be very proud indeed to refuse a useful thing because it was also funny. By the spring of the third year, the north section was fully cleared and seeded with the rye that Peter had recommended for building the soil before she attempted cultivation there. The mushroom beds had been expanded 3 times. She had a cold-frame structure over the lower hollow, built from salvaged window glass and rough-cut timber from the scrub, and it extended the productive season through November, which meant she was now delivering to Kemper 10 months of the year. She had paid off a tool debt she had taken with the blacksmith, and she had bought a proper wagon of her own, second-hand but sound. She had also, over the winter, taken on a project that had nothing to do with her own land. The Creek Road families who had worked for her the previous summer had thin, leached kitchen garden plots, the kind of soil that had been worked without amendment for 20 years and had given back less and less each year in consequence. She had shown them, one family at a time, what she had done with the Holt parcel's cleared sections, the wood chip mulch, the cover crop rotation, the simple way of reading what a soil needed by watching what it grew voluntarily. She did not charge for this. She brought Peter with her twice when the questions got technical, and Peter answered them in his deliberate accented English, and drank whatever was offered, and went home satisfied in the way of a man who has lived long enough to know that passing knowledge along is a form of lasting. In April of the third year, Aldous Kemper made a trip out himself, not his driver but Kemper in person, in a cleaner wagon. He sat at Clara's table, which was the Holt's old table that she had found under the bindweed in the first summer, and refinished over 2 winters, and he told her that he had a standing contract offer. A restaurant in the city, a serious one, wanted first right of purchase on her entire production of the honey fungus variety, the prized European strain that was still 2 years later almost unknown in American markets, for a premium price and a 2-year term. He spread the contract papers on the table, and Clara read them with the careful steadiness of a woman reading a map of somewhere she has worked hard to reach. She asked for 24 hours to think. Kemper left the papers and went to see if Peter was home, because they were old acquaintances, and Clara sat with the contract and a cup of tea and did the arithmetic forward. Not survival arithmetic, but its opposite, the arithmetic of what security looks like when it is real and not just hoped for. She signed in the morning. She had Peter witness it because he was the only person whose witnessing she wanted, and because she felt that the moment deserved someone who had been there at the beginning. Peter looked at the paper and the signature and the contract amount, and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "The ground holds more than it shows," and this time he said it as though confirming something, the way you confirm a thing that has now proven itself out past all doubt. She put the contract in the tin that had once held $12.40. She drove the survey stake into the corner of the property a little deeper that afternoon, not for any legal reason, just because the gesture satisfied something in her that needed satisfying. The county came around in the gradual, graceless way that counties come around, not with an apology because communities do not, as a rule, apologize, but with the steady accumulation of small reversals that add up to the same thing over time. The farmers along the creek road, whose kitchen gardens were visibly recovering, said they had known she was capable. The teller at the bank said it had been an interesting investment from the start. Raymond Pruitt said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, the most eloquent thing he had contributed to the conversation. Delbert Foss, when he came back the following spring to deliver the updated reassessment in his official capacity, came without the air of official sympathy. He came with the straightforward manner of a man performing a necessary function, which was all Clara had ever wanted from him. She offered him a cup of tea. He declined politely. They concluded their business. He left. Peter died in the winter of the 4th year, peacefully, in the way that a person dies when they have arranged their affairs and said what needed saying. He left his rye fields to a nephew in the county, and he left his hand-drawn map of the Holt parcel. Clara was his neighbor and the last person to whom he had passed his knowledge, and so the bequest was a natural one, annotated further in his last months with the additions and observations he had made watching Clara work, to Clara herself. She framed it and hung it above the table. She hired the Sweat children's father that spring, a quiet, careful man named Elias, who knew timber and had been wasted doing odd labor since his wife died. He built her a proper root cellar and a cold storage structure over the winter, and in the spring they began the cultivation trial on the north section, not mushrooms this time, but the herbs and medicinal plants that Peter's map had noted as prospering in that microclimate, and that Kemper had told her carefully that his city contacts had begun asking after. Jonas Sweat, who was 16 by then, 2 years on from the summer he had first worked the slope, had developed a system for mapping the mycelium spread through the beds using nothing but a pointed stick and his close observation, which he could not have explained in scientific language, but which was accurate. Clara wrote down his method in a notebook with his name on the cover, and told him that it was his, that she had not invented it and would not claim it. He looked at her the way young people look at adults when an adult does something they were not entirely prepared for. She told him also that she intended to expand the beds to the property that adjoined hers to the northwest, which had come onto the market that spring at a price she could now afford, and that she expected to need a head grower for the new section, and that if he was interested in the position, the wages were fair and the work was real. He said he was interested. She said she thought he would be. The long blank of that terrible drought summer stood, in the county's memory, as the dividing line between the way things had been and the way they became. Afterward, people planted differently, with more attention to water, to shade, to what a piece of ground held in its deep layers that you couldn't see from the road. Several of the Creek Road families had taken what Clara had shown them and applied it beyond the kitchen garden, and their farms showed it, quietly but unmistakably, in the way that good practice shows, slowly, and then all at once. The 40 acres that had sold at tax sale for $12.40 was, by the end of that third full season, supporting 3 families in wages, feeding the Hollow and the Creek Road and the city restaurants 60 miles east, and growing things in its sheltered beds that had been growing there, undiscovered for 40 years, waiting with the particular patience of things that are very alive and have nowhere better to be. The bindweed still came back on the outer sections. It always would. Clara pulled it when she found it, root by root, because that was still the only way. She had stopped minding the work of it. A thing that grows back is not a defeat, she had decided. It is just a condition, and conditions can be managed by someone who is paying attention and does not give up. On a morning in the 4th October, before the light was fully up, she walked the hollow with a lamp and counted the new clusters on the expanded beds. Pale silver gray and honey gold against the dark earth, basket after basket after basket, accounted for in her head, the numbers running clean and sure, the arithmetic of abundance so different in its weight from the arithmetic of survival, though it is made of the same patience and the same refusal to stop. She set the lamp on the foundation stone and looked up at the ridge where the limestone bluffs caught the first thin line of dawn and threw it back down the slope. The spring above the tree line ran steady as it always had, cold and certain, feeding the hollow that fed everything below it. The geese were beginning to stir in the pen. She could hear Augustus making his preliminary opinions known to no one in particular. Somewhere on the north section, a crow was performing its own arithmetic on the rye stubble. She thought of Peters saying what he said, "The ground holds more than it shows." She thought of the map on the wall inside, and the tobacco tin with the contract in it, and the $12.40 that had bought 40 acres of disgrace, and turned out to be, in the long run, and the careful looking, and the stubborn patient working, the only $12.40 in the world that needed spending precisely where and when she had spent them. Being right, she had learned, does not announce itself. It simply becomes the shape of the life you are living, and you recognize it the way you recognize a room you built yourself, by how exactly it fits, and by the quality of the light coming in.